How many people here have listened to a fifth step? Oh, cool. Well, some of you identify with this. You know, in the book, it says in the sexual inventory, it says that we do not want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. And I really think that's important. We all come here with sex problems. We're afraid of being judged because we did things just for gratification or because we didn't want to be alone that we're not comfortable with. So we don't want to be the arbiter of anyone's sex conduct. And I honor that. I don't have any judgments. When I listen to a fifth step, I just try to listen. And I'm listening to this a couple years ago. I was listening to this guy's fifth step, and he's getting into the sex part of it. And, I'm trying not to be the arbiter of his sex conduct, but I finally had to say something to him. I said, listen, you've got to quit masturbating. And he looked at me and he said, how come? I said, because I'm trying to listen to your fifth step. That's a haunting visual, isn't it? Oh, jeez. Many guys I know have a hard time with resentments because our ego is such that we don't want to admit even to ourselves that someone got the best of us or someone hurt us. We like to be macho, we like to be bulletproof, all that. And so some guys, when you ask them to list your resentments, it's not uncommon. Well, they'll go, well, I don't really even have any. I just let it go. And when you know that's not true. So I've learned to come at guys from the flank rather than direct head on. And so I'll say things to you. Oh, no resentments. He said, no, I don't really have any resentment. I said, okay. Can you list the stupid people? And I always get a look like, yeah, that's quite a few right there. Can you list the people you feel smugly superior to? Can you list the people that someone should straighten out? The wrong people. Put down the people that owe you and the rest of the world an amends. And there's, as the book says, we're bound to create a long list. And so we create this list, and I'll tell you that what I tell the guys I sponsor, I say, listen, here is one place where you have to allow yourself to be childish and petty and put them all down. And they'll say, why do I have to do that? Because you are childish and petty anyway, so just put it all down. And we get this long list, and we find out the little bullet points and what was hurt, threatened, affected. And then the book walks us on page 66 through trying to sell me the idea that this stuff's killing me. It's cutting me off from the sunlight of the Spirit. Resentments keep you hostage in your own head. Resentments, more than anything else, will alter your perception of reality. Do you ever notice when you get a resentment? Some of you might have a resentment that's decades old from a family member. Do you ever notice from the moment you get the resentment, that person can't do anything right from that moment on? And it's as if the ego is hell-bent to be justified in hating that person. And I've had resentments towards people for such childish, pathetic things that they're not really justifiable. When you couldn't even say it out loud because it'd make you look bad. So what happens is I have to watch them to find a more legitimate reason to hate them. Right? To validate my judgment, because the ego wants to be validated. And so I have these three columns. The position of a prosecuting attorney. And the book says, if you've really bought the idea this stuff's killing you, that there is no price too high to pay for freedom. Are you willing to consider the possibility that you're wrong? And it says we're prepared to look at them from an entirely different angle. So I got all these judgments down. Am I willing to look at them from an entirely different angle? And what would that look like? Well, if it's fair to say that I built these cases on these people, and I'm looking at them from the position of a prosecuting attorney in a courtroom, then an entirely different angle would be to get up and walk across the courtroom and sit down on the defense table and start pleading the case through their perspective. What did it look like to them? One of the little things I do with guys all the time, especially if resentments that are decades old, like father, mother, that kind of thing, I say, all right, I want you to imagine that this person had hit some terrible bottom and joined some, unbeknownst to you, joined some 12-step program. And they're sitting with their sponsor. And they're just beaten by this. And they want to do the best they can. And they're writing their first inventory. And they're doing their resentment list. And they put your name in column number 1. What would they put in column number 2 next to your name as a resentment? We're prepared to look at this from an entirely different angle. What did it look like to them? This is such a beautiful thing, because if it's true that selfishness, self-centeredness is the root of my troubles, then it makes perfect sense that the solution must contain some other centeredness, a different perspective, because the perspective I have is ego-driven and it's killing me, and my need to be right about them and reinforce my case I've built against them. So to look at this from an entirely different angle, to put myself in their shoes. What if I was raised the way they were raised? What if I was hurt the way they'd been hurt? What if I was afraid the way they maybe were afraid? What's their backstory? What are the things about them I don't know that would have driven them and maybe driven me to do what they did? Can I imagine? What would it take? What would have had to happen to me? What would I have to feel? How selfish would I have to be? How afraid would I have to be to do to somebody else what they did to me? Can I get honest enough? Can I come down from my throne of judgment? Can I come down to earth? Can I put myself in their shoes? Can I see them? Can I see in them what God sees in them? Because God sees the whole picture. See, my ego only wants to see the stuff it can judge and use to aggrandize myself and feel smugly superior. To build my case. To be right. But can I see it from their point of view? Can I see what God sees? Can I awaken to this? The book goes on to say that these things really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoings of others, fancied or real, had the power to actually kill. I could introduce you to people in state penitentiaries in the U.S. that are going to be locked up probably for the rest of their life unless they luck out with a parole. They probably never will be, because they've committed a murder and they discovered they killed the wrong person. That their rage took them and drove them to build a case against somebody, and they didn't have all the information. It was erroneous. And they took a life, they took 2 lives. Because that's the old adage about revenge. You might as well dig 2 graves. They took their own life. Because there they are in prison for the next 25, 30 years as a result. So the wrongdoings of others, fancied or real, had the power to actually kill. How could we escape? We saw that these resentments must be mastered, but how? We cannot wish them away any more than alcohol. And this is really true. And the ego is so, my ego is so clever that it will fancy. Here's what happened to me. I get sober, and my ego learns things about AA before I do. It's smart, it's clever, it's smart. It learned very early that resentments are the number one. The resentments are bad, number one offender, bad. Spiritual giants, and which is I need to be one. Spiritual giants do not have resentments. Nobody wants to touch the hem of the garment of a guy with resentments. And so what my ego does is it knows that resentments are wrong. So it convinces me that we're just never going to have them again. That's not how you get free. That's how you build an ulcer. You start to live the double life it talks about in the chapter Into Action, where you create a stage character, the spiritual Bob. And then underneath the surface, I hate people and I resent people and I'm full of fear and angst and vengeance and I don't want anybody to know. And we really are as sick as our secrets. Really. And I start to live the double life it talks about Into Action. I remember about 3.5 years sober, I was still battling depression. I had a lot of resentments. The only thing that was helping me is I was doing a lot of 12-step work. But I hadn't done the rest of the steps yet. And 12-step work, when it says in the book that it will ensure immunity from drinking when everything else fails, that's true. It will keep you sober. If you do some 12-step work every day, it'll keep you sober. It won't get you happy, but it will keep you sober. And I was sober, but I wasn't. I remember I was sitting in my apartment and I was miserable. I was like fighting this low-level depression, and I just churning in my head about my fears and resentments and full of me. And I had a commitment to go and chair this meeting. I didn't want to go, but my sponsor would be there. It was at the TIE club, so I made myself go. And I remember pulling up to the parking lot, and I feel horrible. I don't want to go in this meeting, but I got to chair the meeting. So it was almost as if I had some imaginary spiritual suit, and I just kind of put it on and zipped it up. And I went, put a smile on my face, and I went in and just was amazing. And then I went home and wondered if I should kill myself or not. Because nothing had changed. And by this time, I had done 2 inventories. I'd done the 40-page life story confession, and it was very honest, but it was not transformational. And I did a second one using the 4th chapter of the book, The 12 Steps and 12 Traditions. There's 30-some questions in there, and I wrote most of a page on each of the 7 deadly sins. It was a very interesting exercise, but I didn't discover any truth about me. I didn't face and find any facts about me. I didn't change anything in me. It was not transformational. So this deadly game of pretending like I don't have resentments when I have, I couldn't live with this anymore. And so what do we do here? And before I did the 4th step, I'm taking a guy through the 4th step. And this guy, I really want this guy to be okay. And he's got a lot of resentments. I mean, some people get more than others. This guy's got a lot. And we get to the bottom of 66, and it says we can't wish these away any more than alcohol. And I read that, and he looks at me and he says, well, what do I do? Because he gets it. This stuff's killing him. He says, what do I do? And I don't know. And Joe and Charlie hadn't covered that. They went right from that to, like, where were you selfish? Where were you, right? And he's not ready for that. And I looked at the next 4 words in the book, and like they stood out in neon. It says, this was our course. And I looked up at him and I said, well, this was our course. Like I knew. I didn't know. I'd never done this. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm trying to look like I know what I'm doing, but I don't know what I'm doing. And it says, and it's talking about a 2-part realization that's vital. And this when I was able to do this with all my resentments, it changed my life. When it's such ego reduction. First part, we realized that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Now, that's easy. My ego's on board for that. I like negative labels I can put on people. They're spiritually sick. And they're stupid too. Where's Dr. Kevorkian now that we need him? I'm good with that. They're sick. Yeah, they're sick. Now, if that was all that it said, then nothing would have happened. Nothing would have changed. But it starts to walk me through it now that I've conceded that these people are sick. Then it says, though we did not like their symptoms. What symptoms? What are they talking about? Oh, column number 2. The cause. You mean the bullet points? You mean to say that the things they did that caused the problem are the symptoms of their spiritual illness? And I had to think about it. I ended up with a long 8-step list. I hurt a lot of people. But honest to God, there was not one person on my 8-step list I set out intentionally and maliciously to hurt. Yet I hurt a lot of people. I destroyed my parents. But I didn't mean to. I didn't want to. But did I? Yeah, I did. Why? I guess because I was really sick. I was very selfish. I was full of fear. I was driven by stuff. I was out of control. So I don't like their symptoms. So you're telling me that the second column is the symptoms of their spiritually sickness. I would have never thought of that. And we didn't like their symptoms and the way they disturbed us, column number 3, with pride and pocketbook. And then here's the kicker right here. Now I'm starting to really see that these people are sick, and the things that hurt me and annoyed me and put them on the list were the symptoms of something they couldn't help being. And then it says, I had to realize how this person, like myself, was sick too. Now, what does that mean? In other words, it's not enough to see that they're sick. This is not about a well person egotistically looking down on a sick person. This is about a sick person driven by fears and insecurities and pain and hurt and selfishness, looking right across the table even with another person just like them, who's also driven by pain, by fears, by selfishness, by everything that's driven me is driving them. They're asking me to see myself in these people. And when I started to do that, all of a sudden things started to shift. I started to even have some understanding for some of the people I judged and hated so much over the years. Because I started to see myself, I started to see that they suffered much like I suffered. That they could no more help being the way they were when they hurt me than I could help being the way I was when I hurt people. Did I want to hurt them? No, I really didn't. I just couldn't see past myself. I was just so full of me. My greed and my dishonesty. I lied to a lot of people and disappointed a lot of people, but I don't lie because I'm a liar. I lie because I'm afraid. I steal because I'm afraid. I'll attack you because I'm afraid. I'll hurt you because somebody's hurt me, and hurt people will hurt people. I'm the kind of guy that the cat scratches me, so I go kick the dog. Driven. by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity. I step on the toes of my fellows and they retaliate. And I started to look at these people so differently that there were some of them I started to develop something I'd never had before in my life. Compassion. Compassion comes from two Latin words, cum meaning with and passio meaning pain. When you have compassion, you have the ability to sit with and get and understand their pain. In other words, I see you. I get you. I'm not mad at you now. You're me. You're me on a bad day. You're me. You're me with a worse childhood. You're me maybe being hurt a little bit more than I was. But you're me. And I can start waking up to the truth. That there really is there's no hierarchy here of right or wrong. Right or wrong is the domain of the ego. The soul doesn't care about right or wrong. The soul cares about love. The soul cares about unity. It's only the ego that has to build its cases to aggrandize itself. And when I started doing this, I started seeing, my God, I was so... When I looked at my mother and father from their point of view and looked at what it must have been like to be my parents, I was ashamed. And I had tried to blame them for everything in my life. And the truth was, all they ever did was love me. They weren't perfect. No, they were not perfect parents. Nobody is. But they had sacrificed and they'd gone out of their way. They spent a fortune on treatment centers and psychiatrists, bail bondsmen. When I started to look at them, I started realizing how wrong I'd been about my mother and how wrong I'd been about my father and how wrong I'd been about my sister and how wrong I'd been about my ex-girlfriends and how wrong I'd been about my ex-bosses and friends. And every time I did This Was Our Course and then followed it up with the next two things, it was like a notching down of this ego. I was wrong about them. I know, I'm wrong about them. Oh my God, and I'm wrong about them. Oh, and I'm wrong about them too. And I'm wrong about them. And I'm wrong about them. And so you just get to a point where I don't know nothing. I'm wrong about everything. And then you know the most important thing you'll ever know is you don't know. That maybe is a big piece of the awakening here. I don't know. I started doing that with all my resentments, and then the next action that it says is a prayer, and it's a beautiful prayer because it's a call for action. All great prayers are, the greatest prayers are praying only for knowledge of God's will for us. And then the next greatest prayers are prayers for a call of action to do what we believe God would have us do, whether it's forgiveness, whether it's making amends, is I need His strength to do what I need to do, what I believe is His will. And this is a great call for action. We ask God to help us to show them the same tolerance, pity, and patience we would cheerfully grant a sick friend. What I'm really saying is I want to be able to be around them with the same pity, patience, and tolerance that God would have towards them or towards me. I want to see them like God sees them. And so my job becomes not only to pray for that, but to start acting as if I mean it. Start acting like a guy who's patient with them and tolerant. Maybe even feel a little sad that they're suffering, as I have suffered in my life. And I got free, and maybe how could I help them to get free because they're not free? And I started to really change my whole view of a whole bunch of people. Then the last thing, in the middle of page 67, it says, referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely look for our own mistakes. A couple lines down, it says the same thing again. And when Wilson says the same thing twice in a paragraph, he's pretty serious about it. And he says, we disregard the other person involved entirely, which is a lot. So one of the misnomers in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I've said this, my first, many years of sobriety, I would talk about this part of the 4-step as the place where we look for our part. It doesn't say that. Matter of fact, it kind of implies the opposite. There's no parts here. We're going to put out of our minds what they had done. We're going to disregard them entirely. I'm looking just for my own mistakes, my side of the street. Because if I think in terms of parts, okay, I'm going to look for my part. Here's what happened, and here's my part, right here. Well, when you think in terms of parts, aren't you unconsciously reserving the right to consider that they had a part? That they're partially to blame? The book says we put out of our minds the wrongs others have done. We resolutely look for our own mistakes. And for the first time in my life, I could not hide my selfish, vindictive, self-seeking, dishonest behavior in the shadow of what I found wrong with you. And I'm a master at that. I often think it's one of the reasons I was so judgmental. I needed to have cases built on everybody to justify me, right? So I could get away with whatever I wanted to get away with, because if I could find enough wrong with you, we don't have to look at me. And now the book's asking me to stop it. Become a man. Become an adult. Take the responsibility. Stop blaming other people. And where was I at fault? And when I couldn't I had bosses, I worked places that I stole from them. And I stole from them because I was able to find stuff wrong with the boss. Maybe he stole, so it gave me a license to steal. But what if I couldn't look at what he did? And what if I had to just look at what I did without any consideration of what he did? Well, then I'm a thief. It was a lot better when I'm just doing what the boss does. But what if I had to look dead on at me? What if I had to look dead on at my behavior with my parents and with my sister, all the people I'd hurt? I can't justify me anymore. And what an amazing change in perception. I'll tell you, if you do this, your 8-step list is going to be a little longer than you suspected. Because we have a tendency to exonerate ourselves by looking at what they did. I can't tell you how many times I've talked to them about making amends to somebody, and they said, well, he did more to me than I did to him. Well, that's not the point. We disregard the other person involved entirely. This is our recovery. It's our side of the street to clean up. It's our task. Referring to our list again, putting out of our minds the wrongs others done, we resolutely look for our own mistakes. Where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, or frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely my fault, I tried to disregard the other person involved entirely, and where was I to blame? We got this all down in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly, and we're willing to set these matters straight. And they don't tell you this up front because it would be bad to know. But if they told you, I think you'd edit your 4th step. If they told you that everyone on your resentment list is going to be on your 8-step list, I mean, you'd go, what? And yet you come out the backside and you see how wrong you had been. And how the separation between you and this person, that you're the one that generated it. I am the source of the separation. And remember that amends is not about right or wrong. Amends is about mending the separation between me and one of God's kids. There is no right or wrong. And sometimes we make amends to people, and I've had to do this many, many times, where objectively they did me more harm than I did them by a long shot. But I'm trying to put out of my mind what they did. We're not here to judge them. I'm here to judge me and my level of selfishness and dishonesty. And so I make amends to someone who really owed me an amends. And sometimes you'll be surprised. Sometimes it'll open the door and then they'll start to open up a little bit and confess that they kind of regretted what they did to you. Sometimes they don't. But it doesn't matter. I'm there to clear up my side of the street, not theirs. And what an amazing thing. I'll give you an example or two before we move on to fear. When I was in my 11th year sober, I went through a divorce, and it was horrific. I discovered in one day, the day after the divorce was final, and I went through this divorce. I'll tell you, the truth is, I didn't really know why we're getting a divorce. The day after the divorce, I knew, because my ex-wife of 12 hours and my 2-year-old daughter, who I adored, moved in with one of my sponsees and one of my best friends. And I discovered that they'd been sleeping together the last year of my marriage. And you guys have been telling me for over 10 years there's no such thing as a justifiable resentment. Yeah, well, hey, I got one now. I mean, listen. I mean, this, and it made me really sick. But I knew that the answer was in this process, and I threw myself into working with newcomers, and it saved me from me. And I went back through the steps, and I listed both of their names in column number 1. I put down the bullet points of, the infidelity and the lies, etc. What was hurt, threatened, interfered with, affected, injured, everything. Pride was terrible. Sex, money, security, emotional security, material security, ambitions, everything. And then the book's asking me to look at it from an entirely different angle, to look at it through their eyes. To see, and this was our course, how the person who I resented, my ex-wife and my temporarily ex-sponsee, to look and see how they were perhaps spiritually sick, and to look at their symptoms of their spiritual sickness, and to ask myself, am I like that? Is some of what drove them in me? And I had to put myself in the place of both of them. And when I did my wife, it was not easy, because I fancied myself a really good husband, because I never cheated on her. I never even argued with her. I was a good provider. I was working 12, 16 hours a day sometimes, trying to build some kind of future. I fancied that I was this great husband. But when I looked at it from her side of the street, it didn't look like that. What I saw was a woman who she didn't work. She didn't have anything to fill her life up with. She didn't have sponsees. She didn't have AA. She had a marriage that she put all her eggs in that basket. And in no time at all, she found herself married to a guy who was working from 8 in the morning to midnight most days. And when he wasn't working, he was going to AA because he had to treat his alcoholism. She found herself in a marriage to a guy who just wasn't there much. And even when he was there, he'd be so wrapped up in worries about business and stuff that he was sort of emotionally inaccessible, consumed with his concerns about work and the business he's trying to save, and etc. And I started to get a sense of how lonely I would be in a marriage to someone who's gone and I don't have anything else to fill my holes. See, I never, ever once suspected a problem because my vacancies were very full. I mean, I had a business, I had employees to manage, I had a sponsees and AA. I mean, my life was full. It was over full. I was running over. It was so full it was driving me crazy from time to time. But there was no emptiness. And when I started to experience and understand what she must have felt like, and I started realizing, you get me lonely enough, you get me empty enough, you get me vacant enough, and I'm liable easily to do things I normally wouldn't do if I wasn't driven by those fears and those anxieties. And I remember thinking at one point, I'm surprised that she didn't ask for a divorce, and then I realized she couldn't. She was the adult child of an alcoholic and could not face confrontation. She couldn't even tell me that she was unhappy. She couldn't do that. She just wasn't wired that way. And I started to experience the emotional prison. And you can argue it was of her own making. Well, maybe, but regardless, the prison she lived in that marriage. And I knew at some point that I would have easily done the same thing she did. In a desperate need for validation, for love, for some kind of affection, for something, I could have easily, in that desolation, done that. And I started to understand her. And when I went to her to make my amends, it was very touching. I told her how sorry I was that I was so selfishly wrapped up in my life and my business and my stuff that I never really understood how much I wasn't there and how alone I left her. And I said to her at one point, I said, I know that you're not the kind of person that would cheat on her husband. It's against your principles. And she's a very high principled person. It truly is. And I told her how sorry I was that my selfishness put her in a position where that looked like a good idea. And at some point in the conversation we were having, she started to cry. And I started thinking about it later. I thought, maybe all she ever wanted was me to understand. Right? And we're pretty good friends. I don't see her much. I met her in AA, but she's not an alcoholic. That happens more than you imagine. She could drink if she wants to. I always thought it was unfair that people who actually could drink if they wanted to don't want to. Isn't that weird? That's so weird. And so she went to school and became a minister. She's a minister at a church. So in my small way, I drove her to the Lord, I suppose. My second wife ended up in prison, so there's balance in the universe. And I was able to do him, and I put his name down, and he was easy. Because I'm a guy, and I know guys are just the best, the most honorable, well-intentioned guy in the world. If he's naive enough to think he has power in areas where he doesn't have power, he's able to cave and do things he'll later regret doing. Guys have been doing that for thousands and thousands of years. Because you think you're an oak tree until a woman touches you in certain places, and then you go, where'd those principles go? They were here a minute ago, guys have been doing, and it's a shame, but if anything, guys I know learn to protect themselves from themselves, and that under the right set of circumstances, that it's possible to do something you're later going to hate yourself for doing. I got a sponsee right now who's in the middle of that. So I put myself in his shoes, and I understood exactly what had happened. He was very lonely in his early sobriety. He was like really overweight. He later had that stomach surgery and lost 160 pounds, but he was very overweight, and he had a hard time hooking up with anybody. He said to me one time, he said, gee, Bob, if I could just someday have what you have with Karen. I didn't know he meant specifically. I thought maybe he was talking in a generalized way. So when out of desolation and loneliness and resentment, when she opened that door for him, he did what 1,000 guys have done over 1,000 years. He caved and did something he'd later hate himself for. And my making amends to him was strange, because he did not know why I was being nice to him. He thought for some time I was setting him up and I was going to have him killed. Because we all get on the same page. He thought that I was going to have him killed because he kind of thought that's what he deserved, right? And he didn't deserve that. He didn't do anything that I, under the right set of circumstances, I could have done that, I suppose. If anything, I just won't let myself be in that circumstance, or I'm going to do something I don't like myself for later. You got to protect the servant and their ability to serve. Because we're all human here. We're all feet of clay. We're all capable of making mistakes. And I'll tell you what I like. When I've made a mistake, I want you to be tolerant and kind and forgiving. But when you make one, nah. And the problem is, I can only get what I give. In the Lord's Prayer, which I think it's an ancient Hebrew prayer that predates Christianity, and some of the original versions of it are just amazing. And it says in there something that Emmett Fox talked about this a lot. This process, this interconnected process. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. If you want to feel forgiven, if you want to take yourself off the hook, if you want to stop being a self-deprecating depressive, you're going to have to take other people off the hook first. And it's a funny thing that happens. As I started to understand, forgive, and have compassion for those I hated, it snuck up on me, and I found myself being more tolerant of my own imperfections, more willing to forgive myself for not being perfect. But as I held the bar very high for you, unbeknownst to me, I was holding it very high for me. So not only would I beat you up for being less than perfect, I'd beat me up. Because when you release the dogs of judgment, they always come back and bite their master. And so to get free of the depressive nature and how I used to beat myself up emotionally, I had to set you free. And I had to set you free by trying to understand you. And I sponsor that guy today. He'll be at my house the Tuesday after I get home. He's a good guy. Good guy. But I had to change my whole view of him, and then go make amends to him. And I've shared this. Him and I were doing a workshop together one time down in Arkansas. It was so funny. And I'm telling the exact same story I'm telling now. Only I'm not telling who the guy is. And the guy's he's sitting next to me, right? And then I got done with the resentment, and then I said it was his turn to talk, and I said, well, and now we're going to hear from the guy I was just telling you about, Craig. Here's Craig. And there was a woman in the front row. She went like that. And Craig went, gotcha. And it was hilarious. But AA works. You know, it's odd when the resentment is truly put to rest, the love that was there before is restored. I've watched this with guys that have had cases built on their dads for decades. And when they processed their father through this thing, and they saw their dad's sickness, and they saw that their dad was a lot like them, driven by a lot of the same, and they took their dad off the hook, all of a sudden they started to have the ability to have some understanding and compassion for their father. Regardless of how horrific he'd been. because we don't concern ourselves with that. I had to look at what kind of a son was I and not hold it up against my father's mistakes, but hold it up just in its own light. And the next section is fear. Fear is the muscle of the ego. You know, when it says in the book, we're driven by 100 forms of it, boy, they're not kidding. In step 7 in the 12 steps and 12 traditions, Wilson says that self-centered fear, and I don't think there's any other kind, self-centered fear is the chief activator of all our defects. And it's really true. You want me to lie to you? You got to scare me. You want me to steal? You got to overcome me with fear of financial insecurity. You want me to act selfishly? You got to convince me that you've got something that's I have to have. You scare me enough, and I'm able to act badly. The only difference I think today in my life is I'm capable, but I'm going to have to make amends because I can't sit with it. That's the difference between alcoholics and sociopaths. An alcoholic is capable of doing anything a sociopath has done. The problem is it haunts us, and it doesn't bother them. It eats my lunch. And so I am forced. I think alcoholism is such a blessing. I'm sure it looked to my parents and it looked to people I knew as if I didn't have any ethics or morals. That's not true at all. The problem was I had such high standards that I could not live up to them, that I would punish myself and then get drunk and act out on that stuff. Because I had such a high judgment of others and of myself. I was my own worst critic. I was a critic of you, but I was also a critic of me. And when I hurt you, and I hurt a lot of people, it always bothered me. It fueled my alcoholism. The more selfish I was, the more harm I did, the more I had to drink, the more difficult it was for me to be in the presence of the guy I was beginning to hate the most, which was me. Because it's an inescapable reality that when I hurt you, I'm going to end up feeling about myself the same way you feel about me. When I act like a jerk and you think I'm a jerk, you know something? So do I. We're on the same page about Bob. And that was inescapable for me. I have a conscience. I have an overactive conscience. That's why I drank to kind of just to dial it down. It was a hell of a taskmaster. And yet, as I developed more and more compassion and forgiveness and understanding of others, I inadvertently developed more for me. One of my favorite descriptions of spiritual growth comes from some of the Benedictine writings. And it says that spiritual growth is an ongoing awareness of our own limitations along with God's incredible generosity. It's not that I grow towards perfection even though I may a little bit. It's that I grow more right with the person God made. That I develop some spiritual progress, some spiritual growth, but more so as more of a self-acceptance of my own imperfections. I want to read a little letter that was written to Bill Wilson. Bill was the first. Think about at times how you've had judgments against old-timers in your own AA group. And we've all done that from time to time. And Bill Wilson was no exception. A lot of people fired at Bill. A lot of people built cases against him. A lot of people took his inventory, and he survived it pretty well. Here's a letter that Bill wrote. There was a group in Chicago that got on a rant and wrote him this ranting letter about everything that they thought was wrong with him. And Bill had a big ego. He never denied it. Bill had a lot of problems. He never denied it. And these people took his inventory in a scathing letter, and he sent it to him. And here's Bill's response to this scathing approach. And just imagine someone who just read you the riot act and just told you everything that was wrong with you, and see if you would have responded like this. Bill said back to them, "The fact that you seem disillusioned with me personally may be a new and painful experience for you, but many members of AA have had that experience with me. Most of their pain has been caused not only by my several shortcomings, but by their own insistence on placing me, a drunk, trying to get along with other folks, upon a completely illusionary pedestal, a station which no fallible person could possibly occupy. I'm sure you'll understand that I've never held myself out to anyone as either a saint or a superman. I have repeatedly and truthfully said that AA is full of people who have made more spiritual progress than I ever have or can make. That in some areas of living, I have made some decided gains, that in others I seem to have stood still, and in still other ways I may have even gone backwards. I am sorry that you are disillusioned with me, but I am very happy that even I have found a life here." Bill Wilson, 1960. I want to be like that when I grow up. He never defended himself. He never contradicted them. He just pretty much, they took his inventory and he just said, "Yeah, you're right. I'm sorry." Let's take a break.